Good morning, everyone. Here we are coming to the end of another week, and as things hopefully are beginning to loosen up a little bit, I think most of us are fantasizing the day we can go and get our teeth cleaned or our hair cut or something else that has been denied us, in my opinion, rather unreasonably. But that's not, well, that is actually what I want to talk about. I figure it's the end of the week and I can kind of ventilate a few of my thoughts. And I have to warn you that this may sound like in the beginning that I'm on a political rant, and that's not really where I'm going, because I think there's some real spiritually important things that we need to understand in the context of what's going on in our country right now. What brought it to my mind was basically a news article that just came out today quoting Rahm Emanuel. You may not remember who Rahm was, but he was President Obama's chief of staff. He was, after that, he became the mayor of Chicago and did a pretty poor job there. But it was he who said, in the face of the 2008 economic crisis, he said we should never let a crisis go to waste. And what we saw, and what that really implied, was that over the next 8 years, the Obama administration made really a radical attempt to reshape the nation into a country that, for lack of, I don't know, I would describe it as a country led by elites and technocrats. Part of the problem we have today in America is that many who are in political power or in economic power really have a evolutionary view of society. They see themselves as being evolved intellectually and capably above the rest of us, and that they need to kind of guide and control things. And this is really the attraction to many people about a socialist system, because in a socialist system, those government elites take over everything, I mean, including industry. And so it's really a top-down kind of management style. And the problem with technocrats, which make up a big part of the governing part of our country, is that they see everything only in numerical terms. And so part of the reason of always publishing how many people have been affected and how many people have passed away because of this pandemic is the fact that everything kind of is evaluated numerically. And there's not the looking at individual situations. And of course, we know now that there's a lot of things that have been played with in those numbers, that the numbers of those who have died of COVID alone is much lower than the number that's being put out. And so many other things. I could spend another hour and a half just talking about the problems, and I think many of you are aware of them. But it's interesting because the statement was originally actually made by Winston Churchill in the aftermath of World War II. The crisis had come and gone, and he said, we have a great opportunity to rebuild the world. He certainly didn't mean it in the way that Rahm Emanuel and those around him view it. But what was really troubling to me was in this reprised quotation that he gave today in the newspaper, he added an interesting dynamic to it. He said, never allow a crisis to go to waste. Start planning for the future. Well, I'm with you so far. And he says, this has to be the last pandemic that creates an economic depression. We're going to have more pandemics, but this has to be the last economic depression. Now, first of all, what I have problems is we're not in an economic depression. We're in this artificially stalled economy that, by all estimations, once it is loosened up again, it can take off and begin to become not only as prosperous as it was, but maybe in some terms more prosperous. And I mean, the economics, the estimation is in the next quarter, once these restrictions are off, that we might see a 20% growth in the economy overnight, in part because it's so restricted. And by the last quarter of the year, see a 4% growth in the economy, which is, about twice as strong of growth than existed in the entire Obama administration. But what really concerns me in this term of talking about being in an economic depression is that basically it gives me an idea of what they're looking at in terms of the future. The only way they can change that to ensure that there's never another economic depression is by so structuring the economy that mediocrity becomes acceptable and normal. In fact, it reminded me, it sounds, it feels more like Orwell's 1984 and all of the social dystopia he predicted that would come in the world because of socialism, which was kind of interesting because he was an avowed socialist. But nonetheless, A culture he described as being full of doublespeak and newspeak. In other words, that the news media literally distorts and describes things in incorrect terms to mislead people, that they would use governmental intimidation and mind-numbing drugs to control the population, which again, I think, why is it that only marijuana stores and alcohol and liquor stores are open during this pandemic, as if they're not encouraging us to become abusive? But the whole point is that it is seeming increasingly that the progressive left is, as they like to describe themselves, are determined to destroy the free market economy and enable the very thing that enabled America to become the most powerful and prosperous country in the history of the world. Well, as I was processing all of this in my mind, I started taking the issue to prayer, and I said, God, I pray that you would expose and that you would frustrate these players who are trying to drive this agenda, and that you would restore the prosperity and the success that we knew that has been really stripped away prematurely by all these draconian overreaches by unelected bureaucrats and the governors who hire them. But as I have been praying about these current affairs, again, dealing with a lot of this pseudoscientific hysteria, the phony and flawed pandemic models, government overreaction and overreach, and really the despotism that coming from certain governors around the country, I started asking God that deeper question, the why question. Why did you allow this to happen in the first place? And that's when I began to remember scriptures that I hadn't thought about in a while. For example, when he said in Isaiah 45:7, the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all of these. Stop it. God says when calamity comes, you have to realize I'm the one who brings calamity. And why does he bring calamity? Well, it was the prophet Hosea who explained to Judah when judgment was coming upon that land. He says in Hosea 8:7, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. In other words, what we're doing is bringing the very calamity upon us that we are now complaining about. And so I thought then, thirdly, about something Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 7. He says, when times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider. And the word consider there means to think carefully about what's going on. In other words, step back and pray for perspective on God, what is going on. And he says, because God has made the one as well as the other. He's made the day of happiness and goodness and the times of bad and calamity. He's made both of them. And he says, therefore, a man cannot discover anything about his future. In other words, what Solomon is saying to us is if we really want to know how to move forward into the future, we really have to begin praying and asking God to guide and direct us. Now, none of this, again, would be happening unless the Lord would allow it to happen. And so as I was reading through the book of Deuteronomy today, and this thought was on my mind, I was really struck by certain passages that most of us are familiar with, but we haven't really thought about in terms of our current situation. Particularly in Deuteronomy chapter 8, when God is speaking to Israel after their 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and he says, when you eat and are satisfied, and when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then, he said, your heart will become proud. Not might, but will. And he says, and then you will forget the Lord your God. And he says, and you may even say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth from me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. And I think that, that's what happens. Pride and arrogance slips in when we begin to prosper and become successful in no matter what realm you're talking about. I mean, even within the church, when the church grows in numbers and buildings and status and prestige, even the church and pastors become kind of proud and become lifted up in their own minds. And that's why sometimes God has to take us back to the desert. Just so we remember, as he said in chapter 8, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years. And why did he do it? He says to humble you, to test you, in order to know what is in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands, so that in the end it might go well with you. I mean, could it be the very prosperity and success and peace and safety and freedom we've come to know and we've come to expect and almost demand has caused our hearts to stray from loving God first and foremost, and we've become proud in our hearts? In chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, he said, when I bring you into the land that flows with milk and honey, which I swore to your fathers, and they have eaten and are satisfied and become prosperous, then they will turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant. Well, let me just simply say, I think there's three things that we need to take away from all of this that I've just covered. The number one, that only God knows and controls the future. Therefore, we should pray that God would guide and direct us in our steps, that we would know how we should move forward. But secondly, that adversity is not an enemy. Rather, it's designed by God to humble us, and it tests us so that we and God can know what's truly in our heart. But also the end result is to strengthen our faith. When we go through difficult times and come out the other side and are blessed, our faith is strengthened. We become more powerful. Therefore, don't fail to learn the lessons that you're going through right now. Don't waste this crisis in terms of your own spiritual experience. Let it be a time where you go deeper into the things of God. And the third thing I'd just like to say, that if we do 1 and 2, in the end, he says, it will go well with you, saith the Lord. In the end, it'll go well with you. So let's trust God. Let's really seek his face, draw near to him, ask him for his leadership and guidance in our life. Because if we do that, his promise is, I will bless you and I will give you success. God bless you guys and go in his grace.